Somewhere, this one right here. Subcommittee will come to order. He's not here. You wanted me to call on Ray Hall?
Yeah. Well, your opening statement and then Mr.
Okay. Today's hearing will focus on the financial status of the Highway Trust Fund and discuss the impact its pending insolvency will have on our surface transportation programs. Federal highway transit and highway safety programs are administered by the U.S. Department of Transportation in partnership with states, public transit agencies, and with localities. While the U.S. Department of Transportation provides financial and technical assistance, the grantees are responsible for implementing the programs on a day-to-day basis. Federal share of the programs are funded almost entirely from user fees collected and deposited into the Highway Trust Fund. When the Highway Trust Fund was established in 1956, the excise tax rates for fuel were 3 cents per gallon. Since then, the tax rate and structure have been revised several times. Currently, a tax rate of 18.4 cents per gallon is levied on gasoline and 24.4 cents a gallon on diesel fuel. Fuel taxes represent approximately 90% of net revenue into the trust fund, but other sources include taxes on tires and heavy trucks. A separate mass transit account within the Highway Trust Fund was created in 1982, which receives a portion of the fuel taxes collected. In 2008, for the first time, the Highway Trust Fund had insufficient revenues and cash balances to meet its obligations. As a result, the Congress authorized an $8 billion cash infusion from the general fund of the Treasury into the Highway Trust Fund. By the end of 2014, a total of $54 billion will have been transferred from the general fund into the Highway Trust Fund to maintain its solvency. This includes an $18.8 billion transfer authorized by Congress last year in MAP 21. As the purchasing power of the federal fuel taxes continues to decline year to year and vehicles become more fuel efficient, current spending levels will continue to outpace the money collected from fuel taxes. Over time, the gap will only widen. MAP 21 is set to expire on September 30th, 2014, and current projections show that the trust fund will once again become insolvent and unable to meet its obligations starting in budget year 2015. Without changes in spending levels or additional revenue, the trust fund will continue to be unable to meet its obligations over the 10-year budget window. Today, the committee will receive testimony from the Congressional Budget Office outlining the financial status of the Highway Trust Fund and its pending insolvency. In addition, we will hear how the U.S. Department of Transportation and its partners would be impacted if and when the Highway Trust Fund can no longer meet its commitments. Many of our members were not in Congress when previous funding shortfalls were addressed, and it's important that all of us understand the fiscal reality we face and the measures the U.S. Department will need to take. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses and call on the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Ray Hall of West Virginia, for his statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate your calling today's hearing. The sobering testimony that our witnesses have already submitted should be a wake-up call for Congress and the administration to step up to address the looming crisis in highway and transit financing. MAP 21 provided 2 years of relatively flat funding. While this gave state departments of transportation some assurances to move forward with projects, it simply did not allow the investments necessary to maintain our infrastructure, let alone build what we need to compete in the global economy. Yet even this insufficient amount of investment is significantly greater than what the Highway Trust Fund can sustain. This hearing makes clear that in fiscal year 2015, the Highway Trust Fund will go off a cliff. Stopping this crisis facing the Highway Trust Fund will require action and difficult choices to address this shortfall. While Washington has avoided the difficult choices, many states have not. States are increasingly coming up with their own plans for raising additional transportation revenues. Over the legislative years 2010 through 2013, 7 states enacted significant transportation revenue-raising measures. This includes a diverse group of states taking steps to increase transportation and infrastructure investment by generating additional revenue from a variety of sources. For instance, in February of this year, Wyoming raised its tax on gas and diesel fuels by a whopping 10 cents per gallon, from 14 cents to 24 cents. And this is a fairly conservative state, as we all know. Maryland's $4.4 billion six-year package enacted this past March includes indexing the gas tax to inflation and adding a 3% sales tax paid at the pump. Prior to enactment, the state motor fuel gas was 23.5 cents per gallon for gasoline. It is estimated that under the package that rate may rise to 43.7 cents per gallon by fiscal year 2017. And Virginia's $3.5 billion five-year package enacted this past April completely eliminated the state's cents per mile gas tax and adds a wholesale tax on gasoline and diesel fuel. Each of these states was confronted with different challenges, yet each stepped up to begin addressing their infrastructure investment deficits and made the hard choices on how best to do that. But the message we should take from this is not that the states can take care of their situation on their own. Yes, the states must and are stepping up, but as we on this committee know very well, there is a significant Federal role necessary in surface transportation. Unfortunately, over the past several years, we have neglected our responsibilities in this regard. That concludes my opening statement. I thank you for having this hearing again, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Now recognize the Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Schuster.
I thank the Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing, and thank our witnesses for being here today. The Chairman and the Ranking Member certainly laid out the landscape that we have to face, and there is a problem. I think we all know that. We have got to find solutions to it. Money is not the only solution. It certainly is a big part of it, but we have to continue to make sure we're streamlining, getting these projects moving faster. Instead of a major project taking 15 years, we need to be able to work to cut that time in half, and that's significant savings. In inflation savings alone, you would save on some of these massive projects millions and millions of dollars. So again, we need to continue to streamline. I know that MAP 21 is passed last year. I don't believe they've implemented all of the streamlining that we put into MAP 21. I think that's going to be of some assistance. But again, we've got to figure out how to fund it. We need to consider all the sources we possibly can, the ways we've done in the past and new ways. I know that several members have come up with innovative ideas that we need to take a look at. I don't know that they solve the entire problem, but they certainly add a tool to the toolbox to help us with this significant challenge that we face. And as the Ranking Member pointed out, there are a number of states that are addressing this. I don't know if he mentioned Arkansas, but Arkansas, the citizens of Arkansas, 81%, I was told, 81% of the citizens of Arkansas voted to increase their sales tax by 0.5% dedicated to funding. So the people of Arkansas, and I think the people of states all across this country know that we have a problem. It's the veins that carry commerce, the blood of commerce is on those highways and byways and bridges, and we need to make sure that we continue to make the improvements and increase the capacity where necessary so that we can continue to be competitive in the world and create jobs. This is about jobs, not just the jobs. Certainly if we build a significant road project, there are jobs, but I'm talking about the jobs that come after that, the 10, the 20, the 30-year jobs that are created by the efficiencies and that come about by having a first-class, world-class transportation system. So I look forward to working with all my colleagues and all of you here today listening in. It's going to take a big effort, not just by us on the committee in Congress, but a grassroots effort across America, making sure the American people, like the folks in Arkansas, obviously, came to the conclusion that something has to be done. But look forward to working with all of you and the stakeholders to make sure that message gets out, make sure the American people are pounding on our doors saying we have a problem, we have to face it, and we have to find a solution to solve it. So again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing, and thank our witnesses again.
Thank you, and thank our panel for the written statements that were submitted, and would invite you to summarize them in approximately 5 minutes. Our witnesses today are Mr. Kim P. Cawley, who's Unit Chief, Natural and Physical Resources Cost Estimates Unit of the Congressional Budget Office, and the Honorable Polly Trottenberg, Undersecretary for Policy of the U.S. Department of Transportation. Welcome to both of you, and Mr. Cawley, would you like to begin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the invitation to testify on the Congressional Budget Office's projections for the highway.
Pull your mic closer. Thank you.
The authority to obligate new funds from the trust fund expires at the end of fiscal 2014, and the authority to collect most of the taxes dedicated to the trust fund expires in 2016. But all of CBO's projections assume that laws are enacted to enable the current trends in trust fund spending and revenues to continue. Specifically, CBO's projections assume that spending authority continues after 2014 at roughly $50 billion per year and grows at the rate of anticipated inflation, and that revenues continue to be collected at current rates after 2016, yielding about $50 billion a year. I think those two amounts, $50 billion in spending and $40 billion in receipts, illustrate why continuing on the current path of trust fund spending and revenues is unsustainable. CBO's projections indicate that in 2015, the trust fund will have insufficient amounts to meet all of its obligations. That means at some point in 2015, the Department of Transportation will be unable to reimburse states for all of the Federal highway and mass transit expenses that they have already incurred. How states will respond to that situation is really unknown. They might patiently wait to be reimbursed by the Federal Government, or they might slow down their construction and maintenance programs, or they could even accelerate their spending in an attempt to receive reimbursements earlier than other states. It's clear, however, that without some change in policy, there won't be enough money to go around. This is not a new situation. The Congress has faced this problem before. For over a decade, trust fund spending has outpaced revenues. In the past, to avoid any shortfalls in making reimbursements to the states, the Congress has authorized nearly $55 billion to be transferred from general funds of the Treasury to the Highway Trust Fund over the 2008 to 2014 period. This morning, I've tried not to repeat every number in my written statement, but I'd like to conclude by focusing on just three more figures that illustrate the size of the problem that the Congress faces when MAP 21 expires, if the trust fund is going to avoid the shortfall that we've been discussing. To avoid the projected shortfall we see in 2015, the Congress could eliminate all highway and mass transit spending in 2015, or raise the tax on motor fuels by about 10 cents per gallon, or transfer about $15 billion from the general fund to the Highway Trust Fund. Of course, those three measures to control trust fund balances could be used in any combination as well. The additional measures needed to maintain adequate balances in the trust fund beyond 2015 are outlined in my written statement. And I'd like to stop here and would be happy to answer any questions about CBO's trust fund projections. Thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Trottenberg.
Thank you, Chairman Petri, Chairman Schuster, Ranking Member Rahal, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today on behalf of the Obama administration and Secretary Anthony Foxx to discuss the future of the Highway Trust Fund. As the Chairman noted, for nearly 5 decades, we had a very successful model for funding transportation. It served the nation well. But in recent years, a number of trends have converged such that the authorized spending levels have greatly outpaced available funds. As the Chairman mentioned, since 2008, we've relied on periodic infusions of general funds to cover program needs, and at times the trust fund has come perilously close to insolvency. And I think we can all agree in the transportation community across the country right now, there's an agreement that a more permanent solution is needed. There's been, as many of you know, a long tradition of bipartisan agreement when it comes to transportation and revenue issues. In 1982, Congress, working with then-President Reagan, raised the gas tax to 9 cents per gallon and dedicated a portion of those revenues to fund mass transit. In 1990 and 1993, Congress, working respectively with President George H.W. Bush and President Bill Clinton, raised the gas tax to its current level of 18.4 cents. with much of the initial increase going for deficit reduction. After that, the gas tax has not been raised again for 20 years. In late fiscal year 2008, the Department for the first time announced that there was insufficient cash in the Highway Trust Fund to fully cover payments due to states. The Federal Highway Administration ceased the practice that it had of that time of paying twice daily bills to state DOTs and moved to paying them weekly. Then Transportation Secretary Mary Peters asked Congress for additional funds to restore solvency to the trust fund, and Congress subsequently transferred $8 billion in general funds. While this resolved the immediate shortfall, it did not resolve the long-term structural deficit. And as we heard here, by the end of 2014, the Highway Trust Fund will be nearly depleted again, and Congress will have transferred over the course of recent years $54 billion in general funds to keep the program afloat. Two fundamental shifts have occurred that are projected to continue the shortfall for the foreseeable future. First, the Obama administration is proud of our accomplishments in raising CAFE standards, but those improvements in fuel efficiency, 10% over the last 24 years for light-duty vehicles, have reduced contributions to the trust fund. Second, per capita vehicle miles traveled, which increased by large percentages for decades in the United States, peaked in 2005 and have been falling ever since, particularly as the millennial generation and baby boomers are driving less. In addition, highway and transit construction labor and material costs have increased by around 70% from 1993 to 2013. So as we've mentioned here, by the end of fiscal year 14, DOT estimates that the highway and mass transit account cash balances will be $4.6 billion and $300 million respectively, and we will once again be facing a shortfall. Although the exact response would be dependent on the specific situation, in the case of a shortfall, the Federal Highway Administration would implement established cash management procedures. Federal highways would only be able to cover some fraction of state DOT reimbursement requests, and that would clearly affect states' abilities to invest in infrastructure, including critical safety and state of good repair projects. Likewise, the Federal Transit Administration would have to implement cash management procedures that would slow down payments to grantees in order to stretch out the available cash on hand. Many of the Federal Transit Administration's 1,300 rural transit providers would be especially devastated by a shortfall in funding. The Administration has consistently supported infrastructure investment, including the President's $50 billion Fix-It First initiative to create jobs for economic investment and rebuild our transportation network. The Administration is also leveraging hundreds of millions of dollars of private investment through our Tiger, TIFIA, RIF, and private activity bond programs. But we are also focused on how we can wring more productivity and efficiency out of our existing system and continue to improve its performance at current spending levels. We're working to streamline project delivery, as the Chairman mentioned, program management, and make better use of collaboration, innovation, technology, and operational improvements. Ultimately, we know that any resources provided to the Highway Trust Fund are paid for by the American people, and we owe them the best value we can deliver for those tax dollars. Over the past 5 years, a variety of solutions have been proposed to address the long-term needs of our surface transportation programs, but clearly none have yet been universally embraced. The Obama administration looks forward to working with Congress and transportation stakeholders throughout the country to find a bipartisan solution to this urgent challenge. I thank the committee, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, and we appreciate both of you helping us address this. It's not necessarily a pleasant task, but it's an important task, and we ask for these jobs, so we're going to have to deal with it as responsibly as we can. In that connection, does the administration have any position on what we should be doing about the default as we move forward to fund our transportation needs?
Well, we have proposed in our budget using the funds available from the drawdown of our commitments in Afghanistan and Iraq to help fund the program in the short term. It's been proposed in our budget the last few years, and it would enable us to not only continue the program at current levels, but grow the program and fund a new rail title as well.
So that would mean basically taking money from the general, that would otherwise go into the general fund and using it to fill in the shortfall in the Transportation Trust Fund for the next few years?
Yes.
And would that drawdown be anticipated to be adequate to maintain the current program?
In fact, the drawdown actually provides, my understanding is, more revenues than would be needed to continue the program and grow it. the administration, as I mentioned in my testimony, we are also looking, at ways of getting more private sector investor into our transportation program. And again, looking for ways we can run the program more efficiently, both run it more efficiently at DOT, but also work with our partners, state DOTs and transit agencies, so that we do squeeze as much value as we can out of every dollar that we're spending.
Could you sort of expand on the thinking of, is it because of historic low interest rates that it makes sense, in your view, to borrow money for the next few years to pay for the transportation investment necessary, rather than doing as many of the states are attempting to do and fund it up front?
I mean, at the moment, again, I think the thinking in our budgets is, as we reduce our overseas military commitment, it makes sense to take a portion of those savings and invest them in infrastructure here at home. There is, I think, a general view right now that interest rates are low, and it's a good time to invest in infrastructure. And clearly, the country has some pretty profound infrastructure needs at the moment. So
if we didn't do that, the money would be used to reduce the deficit, but you feel it's a better priority to fund transportation at this time with the borrowing rather than the deficit reduction?
Well, and I would say, Mr. Chairman, if you look at the administration's overall budget proposal, I mean, a portion of those funds would go to transportation infrastructure investment. Overall, the budget proposal has a number of suggestions on ways to also reduce the deficit. We do also think that is a priority.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Rahal?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just follow up on the Chairman's questions, Madam Secretary, in regard to the cash management procedures, both at FHWA and DOT. Based on your current estimates, what is the timeline when you think that the scaling back of reimbursements to the states will take place?
Yeah, and I want to preface my answer by saying these estimates are a moving target. We revise them fairly frequently. It can be very determined by economic conditions, gas prices, et cetera. So, you have to take that with a grain of salt.
Let me add also, how much notice would the states be given?
Right. Well, I think we learned in 2008 that we need to, as soon as we start to get concerned that the cash balances are going to run low, that we start to talk to states well in advance, so that states can have a sense of what might be coming, and they can plan as well, because obviously they need to think about what a slowdown in cash disbursements would mean for them. As I testified, it looks to us, the rule of thumb has been that you want to have in each account, in the highway account and the mass transit account, about a month's worth of potential disbursements, which is give or take $4 billion in the highway account, $1 billion in the mass transit account. And as I testified, according to our estimates, which differ a bit from CBO's, we will be down to $4.6 billion at the end of fiscal year 14 on the highway side, and for the transit account, down to only $300 million. So as we start to get to the end of next fiscal year, we're clearly going to need to start thinking about what the trust fund looks like and talking to states about what might happen.
Do you think the fear of waiting to get reimbursed by the states will cause them to front-load their spending?
It's a good question, and actually, it turns out...
A run on the bank, so to speak?
It turns out in 2008 that's actually not what happened. There was a concern that states would try and quickly, get to DOT for disbursements. But I think at that time the states had confidence that, Congress and the administration were going to come together and plug up the hole in the trust fund. Whether states would think so now, I don't know.
A good question. Let me ask you about the peace dividend. That sounds good, and that's been the line from the administration for quite some time, taking the drawdown from expenses of 2 wars and spending it here at home. That still requires congressional appropriating action, does it not?
Yes.
Which means you're going to reduce defense spending, and then increase spending for the Department of Transportation, and so you're still going to have that battle here on Capitol Hill, are you not?
I would think you would, yes. I think I would say, Congressman Rahal, I mean, clearly, I think as you're hearing from our testimony today, we have a big challenge here with what we're going to do long-term in the transportation program.
And the peace dividend is not a long-term solution. That's still a Band-Aid approach.
And I think, again, that's one idea that we've put on the table. We know there are a lot of other ideas here in Congress, and clearly it's going to take the work of, I think, a lot of the leaders here in Washington to come up with a solution. This is not going to be an easy problem to fix, for sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Schuster.
Thank you. Just to follow up on Ranking Member Rahall's question on the acceleration, the states, you don't see any of that occurring now? I would think that maybe states, based on when the shovel-ready projects were, that states are going to be looking at this with anticipation that we're going to run out.
The only thing I've seen so far, Mr. Chairman, look, we talk to a lot of state DOTs and transit operators, and obviously they're all keenly following what's happening here in Washington and wondering what the long-term situation is going to be. And I think, states are taking, this is one thing that we've often talked about. States need to take a long time to plan these projects. Big ones can take many years. And I do know that some states are starting to look at what their long-term, list of projects is and think about, well, if we start to have a funding shortfall, what might we postpone? I haven't heard yet that they're thinking of accelerating, but, that doesn't mean that some of them aren't thinking of it.
Right. Mr. Cawley, the accuracy of the projections over the past years on the Highway Trust Fund, have they been accurate, or they've been off, or they?
Well, CBO's projections, I think, have certainly been close. We're rarely spot on with the actuals. I think on the revenue side, there's some difficulty in accurately predicting the change points, if you will, in the economy. For example, the 2008 financial crisis was something we certainly couldn't foresee, and that caused quite a change in revenues. But our most recent estimates have been pretty accurate.
Is there any difference in the accuracy on the highway account versus the transit account? Are they all pretty close to what you project?
I don't think there's a significant difference. I know we have some technical differences with the department about the exact pace of spending for transit activities in past obligations, but it's not too large.
And Secretary Trottenberg, if it's significantly reduce spending or dramatically cut in fiscal year 2015, can you talk about the impacts it'll have on our ability to maintain, on what the effects will be on the states?
I mean, I think it's quite clear that the effects would be dramatic. And again, I think you will start to see, if we draw close to what appears to be a bit of a crisis point, that, state DOTs and transit agencies will start to look at the list of projects they have and potentially start to postpone some of them. And I would one thing I would note for the committee is, and the effects will be different for different states and different transit agencies. As I mentioned in my testimony, particularly for smaller states or districts or rural areas, they're actually much more dependent on fairly frequent infusions of federal dollars. So if there's a slowdown, a larger transit system like in New York perhaps could float along for a while, but some of the smaller rural transit providers, they would run out of money pretty quickly. So the effects will not be even across the country.
And you mentioned in your testimony, as I mentioned in my statement, about implementing the streamlining in MAP 21. I believe the Chairman's had some hearings on that, and can you sort of update us on where we are?
Yeah. Well, we are meeting the deadlines as we go along. We've implemented the first categorical exclusion, which was for projects, emergency projects in existing right-of-ways, and I'm happy to say we already got to exercise that authority with the replacement for the temporary replacement for the Skagit River Bridge in Washington State. So, and I think that was a tremendous success. We have out for comment now the categorical exclusions for projects with minimal federal dollars and projects within existing right-of-way. We are very excited about the provisions within MAP 21, and they dovetail well with some of the things the department has already been pursuing through our Everyday Counts initiative, where we have really been trying to look for ways to speed up the environmental process, make the reviews concurrent, work with all our sister federal agencies. So, we thank Congress for those provisions, and I can assure you Federal Highways and Federal Transit are implementing them aggressively.
Right. And in Sandy, the money that went out to the Sandy, wasn't there some of the MAP 21 streamlining, you were able to utilize that to get money out much quicker?
Yeah, again, luckily the emergency, I think the emergency provision in MAP 21 is going to prove very useful all over the country whenever, unfortunately, disaster strikes.
Thank you. Yield back.
Representative Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses today. I think this is a thing that we just struggle with. I mean, I happen to be from the great state of Maryland, which I think did something both spectacular and really politically difficult over this last session of our General Assembly in terms of understanding that as a state, we have state transportation needs that are not being met and dwindling ability to expect that the Federal Government is going to be the partner that it needs to be, particularly for some of these large projects. And so, and one of the ways that we wrestled with that, of course, was around the gas tax, still not without controversy. Although, as I go around my district and talk to people about this, I mean, there are the set of folks who are understandably angry because they seem to be paying more and more at the pump, but these are the same people who have great complaints about about our infrastructure and whether we're able to meet those needs adequately. And I think many of us have just come to the conclusion that in the same way that we had to absorb the fact that 20 years ago we paid 50 cents for a candy bar, that same candy bar costs $1.25 now. And I look at the gas tax as a revenue source, although not one that we can count on for the future for reasons that you've described in your testimony. And I wonder if there's some hybrid solution, for example, implementing a CPI, which we seem to do on just about everything, and adjusting that CPI so that it is in effect. I mean, as I think, Mr. Cawley, in your testimony, I think you point out that had that consumer price index been in place at 18.4 cents, it would be about 29 cents today. And I'm not saying doing that, but perhaps even implementing a CPI and from day one, from today going forward, and then some sort of temporary one-time adjustment so that we could bring the fund up to some acceptable point, but at least we would have then that structure in place for the future rather than having to continue to revisit this question and spending dollars today that don't hold the same value as a dollar would a year or 10 years from now. And so I wonder if you could talk to us about just, explore the alternatives. I know we're afraid to mention that sometimes on this committee, but it seems to me a realistic approach to try to deal with what is a truly structural problem that's impacting job creation and impacting our ability to meet our infrastructure needs.
I would just say it's interesting. We actually, I think, had for many decades sort of a de facto indexing because fuel usage just increased fairly naturally for so many decades, after 1956. I mean, clearly this is, something I know that's been much debated in Congress. I think it's, in my time, because I worked on Capitol Hill for many years, it's sort of a perennial debate with a lot of different programs about whether you maintain control by, voting regularly to increase revenues, or whether you decide to just put some kind of an index in and let it go on autopilot. I think it's a difficult decision. Again, to some degree, we kind of had de facto indexing for a long time, and part of why we are where we are now is because fuel usage has essentially flattened out. We no longer have that de facto indexing.
I think the option you outlined to start indexing to CPI perhaps in the near future is certainly something we could work with your staff and try to analyze the numbers on. I can't do it here, but it's a possibility we could look into for you.
Thank you. I'll just conclude. I think, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Schuster, Mr. Chairman, it's really incumbent on us to figure this out. I mean, we put an obligation, for example, when the base reorganizing was done. There are facilities all across this country, 2 of them in my district, where we also weren't able to make the kind of structural transportation, structural changes that were needed to accommodate what were increased numbers of employees at those facilities. There's greater burden on our bridges, greater burden on our roads, and we haven't been able to meet those needs. And I just hope that we can find a solution to this. And I would just say that, finally, it makes sense to me that in this environment, we have to create a process where we can come to the kind of bipartisan solution that Secretary Trottenberg pointed out over the history of the highway, the transportation fund. And when we do that, I think we'll get to one that the American people can respect and enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Coble.
I thank the Chairman. Good to have the panelists with us today. Mr. Cawley, your testimony states that the revenue from the gas tax is in decline, while revenues from the taxes on diesel fuel and truck sales are increasing. What trends do you expect to see as it relates to the remaining excise taxes?
Over the 10-year period, we project the combined revenues from all of the various excise taxes that go into the Highway Trust Fund will vary between about $38 billion to nearly $41 billion. So over the 10 years, there is not a tremendous growth or variance in the receipts.
Will these trends, then you may have suggested, but will these trends have any impact in the insolvency of the Highway Trust Fund?
Assuming that spending from the trust fund keeps growing at the same pace it has been in the past, we will have this shortfall that we've been discussing, yes.
Thank you. Ms. Trottenberg, is the impending insolvency of the Highway Trust Fund already having an impact on our federal partners, states, transit agencies, and local entities' ability to plan and move forward with projects?
Yes, I think we're just potentially starting to see a little sign of that, and I don't want to overstate it because I think, you know, so far the states and the transit agencies, I think, are somewhat optimistic that we're going to find a solution. But as we draw closer to the end of the life of MAP 21, and it looks like the balances in the highway and transit trust funds are going down, I think clearly our state and local partners are going to start to, you know, perhaps pull some things off the list, projects that they were preparing to go forward with.
I thank you both for being with us. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield back.
Thank you. Representative Edie Bernice Johnson. Any questions? No. I'm sorry? Who's next? Who's next on yours? No, Mr. Series?
So I think Mr. Series is next.
Who?
Albie, do you have any questions?
Mr. Shoes. Mr. Sears.
Good morning. Thank you very much for testifying. You know, there were many gaps in what we fund. And one of the gaps in the federal funding, I'm finding in our freight transportation network. I was wondering if you think that we could specifically have a tax and just dedicate it to freight transportation and just not have it put in with the highway transportation fund. How do you think that would work, since we're heading for all this shortfall? Would you think that would be something that we could consider, and just dedicate it to freight movement? I come from a district where I have 2 ports, New York. Freight movement is extremely important, and I am concerned that we're not funding it sufficiently. So I'm trying to look for a way to, Mr. Cawley, you don't seem too enthused about it.
I think I'm just trying to follow you. It sounds like a new proposal, and it's not clear to me if you mean freight movements largely through multimodal or just highway-type freight movements. But certainly additional revenues directed to the highway trust funds, whether in another special account or not, could certainly increase the amount of resources available for roads.
I'll say a couple things on that question, Congressman. First of all, I would say the Department has now run 4 rounds of the Tiger Grant Program, and one thing we noticed is, and it was an open competition of all modes of transportation, and freight projects did extremely well. And out of the $3.1 billion that Congress gave us for Tiger, the Department wound up awarding almost $1 billion of it to freight projects. They scored very well in terms of economic benefits and social benefits. So I think there's clearly, a large inventory of important freight projects that are worthy of public investment. And at the same time, as you all know, in MAP 21, you have charged the Department with doing a lot of new work on freight. And I think the goal of our implementation of the MAP 21 freight provisions is to give you all here on Capitol Hill a good sense of what are the freight needs around the country, what are the different ways we might address them, what new types of programs might we need. So I'm hoping actually that our MAP 21 implementation work will help provide an answer to some of the questions I know a lot of you members who are concerned about freight have been asking.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Crawford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you calling this important hearing today. Thank the witnesses for being here as well. This is probably the most important issue that we'll face in this committee as we begin consideration of the highway bill reauthorization next year. And I understand the important role federal funding plays in our nation's highway. In my home state of Arkansas, federal highway funds account for over 50% of the state's highway program funding each year due to the size of Arkansas's highway system and relatively small tax base. It's critical that we find solutions for the long-term solvency of the Highway Trust Fund, and this hearing is an important step in that process. And as has been pointed out earlier today, Arkansas passed a tax that would help in funding highway projects. What advice would you have, I'll start with you, Secretary Trottenberg, what advice would you have for small states like Arkansas and others as we anticipate a further tightening of federal funds geared toward investing in our highways?
Yeah, it's a good question, and you're certainly right, Congressman. There is a wide variation for states in terms of how much they rely on federal funds to make up their transportation program. Typically, smaller states and more rural states that as you point out, might have a very large highway network relative to a relatively small population base, typically rely more heavily on federal funds. And that isn't, in a sense, the way we designed the interstate highway system and why we've been funding it in part at the federal level. I would say increasingly among states large and small, there is an effort to, in addition to, as some states are doing, looking at new revenue measures, to also try and engage in more innovative financing, to look to the private sector to help where they can. Although I think, as this committee knows, to the extent that you're using innovative financing, it's usually money that's being borrowed, and it does have to be paid back with some sort of a revenue source. That can often be a challenge for more rural states.
Talk about possibly a scaled-down state version of TIFIA. I know that some states actually have that in place. Is that a viable option for states to implement?
It's certainly a viable option, and a lot of states have been looking at it. Again, you do need a revenue source to repay the loan. TIFIA provides a financing mechanism, and one that's increasingly very popular because it enables project sponsors to access very low-interest loans and pay them back over a very long timetable. But you do have to pay them back, and typically at the federal level, that is meant through some kind of a toll, a sales tax, or what's called an availability payment, which is just a stream of revenues from the state or local government.
Mr. Cawley, your thoughts on either of those questions?
I guess I just observed that the states have for a long time had safe drinking water funds and wastewater treatment water revolving funds, which are along the lines of what you're talking about for transportation. But there's a dedicated revenue source available for the treatment of sewage and supply of drinking water. So transportation is a little bit different for that model.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yield back.
Representative Hahn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am from California and from Los Angeles, where we have done very well, I think, in passing our own increased tax measures to help fund transportation projects. So I'm really always proud of the voters in particularly LA County, who always seem to agree to tax themselves to fund transportation programs. You know, we talk a lot about the gas tax, and it seems to be sort of the common theme about raising the gas tax, finding some index that automatically does that. So I'm one of 2 members of Congress that drive an electric vehicle. So I'm proud of that, and we too drive the roads and the highways, not as far as we'd like to, depending on the charging stations. But what's your thinking on, you know, we're more and more encouraging carpool lanes, which means people are leaving their cars at home, which means they're buying less gas. We're encouraging the use of alternative fuel cars, electric vehicles. So I haven't been to a gas station in 2 years. So what are we thinking? What are some user fees, or what's a different way to think about a revenue stream besides just a gas tax? Because I think more and more Americans are looking to avoid the gas station. So what's a concept that we might start really looking at and analyzing to achieve revenue from those of us who certainly use the roads but aren't buying gas?
I think a lot of folks have talked about some kind of technologies to charge people based on the amount they use the roads, a vehicle miles traveled type of charge. And I believe Oregon is looking into an experiment to try that type of charge on users. I believe that Oregon is investigating how this might work. I think it requires a lot of technology to track vehicles, where they actually go and how they use the roads. But that's been discussed quite a bit as an alternative to a fuels tax.
I mean, I guess I would take a step back and say, you know, there's sort of a larger question that I think we're potentially still grappling with, which is, you know, there are kind of 3 approaches on the table, or some combination of mixing and matching. There's the current approach, which is we're using general funds to plug up the trust fund. We could let expenditures out of the highway trust fund match revenues, which would obviously, I think, have big impacts on transportation across the nation. And then there are potential other revenue sources. I'm not sure we've gotten to number 3 yet, let alone getting into the details of what we would specifically choose.
Well, I appreciate that. I certainly think we ought to be looking at something other than just a gas tax. I always feel like raising the gas tax is also inappropriate, you know, affects low-income folks, and would like to really find a way that it could be more fair on who's using our highways. And just because you're buying more gas doesn't necessarily mean you're using the highways more than someone who's not. So, you know, the technology exists. We really ought to look at that. I know in Los Angeles we track, we have some fast lanes that folks buy the little tracker they put in their windshields, and it's very easy to track, and we're charged every time we drive in a certain lane on the freeway in Los Angeles. It's not that difficult then to charge the person in that way. So I think we really ought to, I think, be looking outside of the gas tax box as we go forward. Thank you.
Mr. Hanna.
Thank you. Along Ms. Edwards and Ms. Hahn's point, it seems to me that the general paradigm of funding highways through the gas tax, or the notion of a highway use tax, have relevance and have had relevance, but that in many ways they're both becoming somewhat arcane. That, in fact, young people between the ages of 16 and 34 have driven 23% less, from something around 10,000 miles a year to 7,300 miles a year, and that mass transit and urbanization and the fact that we're not funding mass transit the way we, frankly, I think we should, is in fact the case to consider the general fund as a way to allow everyone to pay in a system that even if you don't own a car, and you drive a bike, you use a road. If you order through Amazon.com, you use the road to get things to your. The notion of not going to the general fund for this money, for something, is maybe fundamentally flawed. And I don't say that as a criticism, just a general observation that increasingly roads haven't lost their relevance or importance, but the people who enjoy the benefits of those roads are frankly not paying a fair share. And I worry that all the conversation around highway use taxes, distance mile taxes, may already be becoming irrelevant. Ms. Hans here escapes taxation. I don't know how you do. I want to know what you think about that. Thank you. It's all your fault.
I think, Congressman, we certainly, are seeing and thinking about the trends you're talking about, which have a lot of different implications. Implication number one, with young people and retiring baby boomers increasingly driving less, obviously it's having an effect on the bottom line of the trust fund. It has an effect on the transportation policy side. If the demand for alternative forms of transportation, transit, biking, walking, et cetera, is rising, at the same time that revenues to the trust fund are going down, then that's a real challenge because there is a big demand for other forms of transportation.
Well, I'm concerned, too, that going to the gas tax, and, frankly, the elephant in the room is that somebody's taxes are going up if we're going to do what we need to do someplace. Going to the gas tax may be avoiding an opportunity that we have to talk about this in a much broader way. And either of you, I'm just interested in your opinions.
Well, in some ways, we're already there. I mean, by the end of fiscal year 14, we will have transferred $54 billion in general funds to use for transportation. And in the transit program, a portion of that program has always been funded through general funds. So, even maybe without coming out and saying it, we've been doing a little bit of that now for about the past 6 years.
But the point is we've stopped doing that. And it's a tough conversation.
Well, no, in MAP 21, we've transferred $21 billion of general funds for these 2 years. So it's been ongoing since 2008.
Except that my point is that the conversation is a particularly difficult one in this Congress, and the question isn't what do we do for MAP 21, it's what do we do beyond MAP 21 when we, as you pointed out, bankrupt the fund. So my time has expired. I apologize. Thank you.
Representative Kirkpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Undersecretary, we're talking about vehicle miles traveled, and I represent a very large rural district in Arizona where people drive lots and lots of miles. Have you done a comparison on the impact of raising the gas tax versus going to VMT on rural America?
We have not, but I think as Mr. Cawley mentioned, actually there is an experiment underway in Oregon where they are going to be looking at some of those very issues. So they may provide some pretty interesting data where they're going to be, some folks will be doing VMT, some folks will be paying the regular gas tax, and they can compare the results.
Well, I think it's very important in coming to a solution here that we don't have unintended consequences and that we don't harm the rural areas of the country where they really don't have transportation choices. I mean, it's clear as a nation, yes, our transportation preferences are changing, but that's more in the urban centers. But I just want us to keep in mind, Mr. Chairman, as we talk about this, and Ranking Member Rahal, that we have rural areas in this country where people use the roads, they travel lots of miles, they consume a lot of gasoline, but they're not getting back those tax dollars in terms of investment to make their roads better. And I think it's very important that we continue to keep that in mind as we try to come up with a structure that's going to be fair. Do you have any comments, Mr. Cawley, about that?
It's not something that CBO has specifically tried to look into yet, but certainly we should be thinking about it.
Yeah, will you keep that in mind? And I just have another question for you. In your report, in the CBO report, you say that we have to come up with a 10-cent per gallon gasoline tax increase if we're actually going to put the Highway Trust Fund on a fiscally sustainable path. Do you mean that on gasoline and diesel? It wasn't clear in your statement.
All motor fuels, right?
All motor fuels, 10 cents per. And In 1956, when we first enacted the tax, it was 3 cents per gallon. Have you done a percentage of what that was per gallon of gasoline at the time? I mean, are we within the same range that we were in 1956 when we were taxing 3 cents per gallon?
I haven't done that particularly, and I'm not sure I can do it in my head.
Okay, well, maybe I can have my staff do that. I'm just curious about that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Ribble.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you both. I'm over here to your left. Very good. I know it's kind of hard to find. You get the sound coming out of the air here. Ms. Trottenberg, I'm curious about your testimony today in one respect. On your written testimony on page 7, you have a section entitled Administration Proposed Funding Solutions. However, in the 3 paragraphs that are contained in that section, there are no proposed funding solutions. Does the administration have solutions for us?
I mean, Congressman, as I mentioned before, in the President's FY14 budget, we've proposed taking a portion of the funds that were previously going for our military engagements in Iraq and Afghanistan and using that to invest in infrastructure here at home. We're also increasingly looking at ways that we can get more private sector investment into our transportation system, but I think we also acknowledge for a long-term sustainable solution, we're going to need to work with you all here on the Hill and with stakeholders around the country to look for some additional solutions.
Yeah, because none of those solutions really, they're very unstable. I mean, another war could pop up tomorrow, and then that whole idea disappears, and we really need to have some type of long-term solution. And conversations like this, while helpful to identify the problem, I think the American people need to be brought aware of the problem, are like many hearings I'm at, high on identifying problems, low on identifying solutions, and what we really need to do is find that. Mr. Cawley, I'm curious, has CBO done any almost macroeconomic evaluations on the impact of motor fuel taxes on the trucking industry? When I look at it, diesel fuel is taxed at about a 25% premium, which is paid pretty much by them. There's a 12% excise tax not only on new truck purchases, which is sometimes better for the environment. We also charge a 12% excise tax on improvements to those vehicles. For example, if you want to convert from diesel fuel to CNG, for example, not only is that an expensive conversion, but we charge even more for that. Then there's an additional tax on the tire weight ability, which goes heavily to the trucking industry. Then we also have a heavy vehicle use tax, which is paid for by the trucking industry. And then after the trucking industry pays for all of those things, if they happen to go on a road that has a toll, they pay that as well. And it seems like it's a very simple thing for Congress to just kind of make them pay the tax because there are fewer voters associated with that. However, when I look at the industry, it's not just the trucking companies. It's the people who build those trucks. It's the people who maintain those trucks. It's the people who load those trucks. It's the people who unload those trucks. It's the people who grow and make the products and build the products that go in those trucks that are all affected by the higher costs. And I'm curious if we're not just shooting ourselves in the foot. We're almost treating this as if it's a sin tax, and typically you use sin taxes when you want less of something, not more of it. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't believe we've prepared any particular studies that look at the impacts on the trucking industry by itself.
Would you concur with my assessment?
That we're increasingly putting charges on to the trucking industry. It's not clear to me that we have, under current law, there are going to be any increases in any of these particular taxes. I mean, it could happen.
I'm speaking more directly to the impact of taxation on a particular taxpayer in relation to how they make economic decisions based on taxation.
I don't really have a conclusion for you on that.
I appreciate that. Ms. Trottenberg, regarding the reduction of the Highway Trust Fund, particularly in revenue between 2007 and 2010, we do know that there was less diesel fuel used. Do you attribute that to a reduction in miles driven due to the Great Recession, or do you think this is a long-term trend?
I think as we were discussing at the beginning of the hearing, although overall fuel usage is going down, actually diesel fuel usage has been going up with some ups and downs in terms of fuel prices and economic conditions. You know, the trucking sector is a growing one.
It is.
So, you know, I think in terms of long-term trends, I haven't looked at long-term projections over many years, but I think for the foreseeable future there is some growth in that sector. Growth in sort of the passenger side of fuel use is pretty flat, and so what you see in terms of revenues to the trust fund is it only goes up a little tiny bit if you look sort of at the next 6 years' worth of revenue projections. Now, that's always subject to change depending on economic conditions, et cetera.
All right. Thank you very much, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Representative Frankel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to follow up on Mr. Hanna's comments, which I thought were well taken. Just first with the story, I remember visiting another country several years ago. I won't name the country. But what struck me was the condition of the roads. I mean, this was the most beautiful country, but you basically had an inch to wherever you wanted to go. There were so many potholes. It would take, I'm from Florida, so what would take me maybe, 15 minutes in Florida was literally could take 2 hours in this other country. Which leads me to my next question, which is, or my first question, which is whether there's been an economic analysis of the impact of not investing in our infrastructure, our highway infrastructure, for example, the cost to American economy, to tourism, to individuals having to repair their cars. Is there any type of analysis that you have?
I'm not aware of anything like that from CBO. I'm sorry.
You're kidding.
No.
What?
I mean, I would say that there is a fair number of reports and analysis looking at questions like how much does congestion cost in terms of time spent in traffic, and looking, I think, at some of the economic impacts of those delays, which are often very hinged on road condition and condition of transit systems. So, you know, there is, I think, a fair amount of literature, and the Texas Transportation Institute does the report that's most well known, where they analyze every year essentially what the costs are to the economy of time spent in congestion, and it's tens of billions of dollars.
The reason I asked that question is because I'm really, as I said, following up on Mr. Hanna's comments, is that it's more than just someone who drives a vehicle that's using the roads. I mean, I come from Florida. We have, thousands and thousands of tourists on the roads, and if our roads were not smooth, then listen, they would go. I mean, the tourism industry is competitive. They would go maybe to another state or another country. We have a lot of people coming in from other countries. So it's the point I'm trying to make is that our analysis, just to look at the user fee or like a gas tax or whatever, may not be the fairest way to go about this, because our roads really, transportation drives our economy. If you want to move, other than anything that goes on the Internet, I mean, if you want to move products, you want to have tourism, you want to get to work, most people go on the road. Want to respond?
Well, I certainly agree with you. Transportation is very, very important. I'm sorry, I'm not aware of an economic analysis that CBO has prepared that tries to ascribe
I guess
all these benefits that you've been talking about.
Well, how about thinking outside of just maybe a gas tax? What I'm saying is that a lot more users than someone driving a vehicle, or just even a truck driver driving a vehicle. I mean, what about the supermarket that's waiting for the food to come in? I mean, the food, doesn't that supermarket depend upon food getting delivered on time?
Right. I mean, I think the point was made earlier that ultimately there's just two sources of money for roads.
Right.
The general taxpayers or the road users.
Right.
And you're making an argument that the general taxpayers benefit too.
All right. Thank you very much. I waive the rest of my time, sir, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Rice.
Good morning, and thank you for being here. Certainly, you know, we have to invest in infrastructure. Our infrastructure is not keeping pace with the rest of the world. It makes us less competitive. Competitiveness is something that I'm really concerned about, keeping American jobs here and bringing some of those jobs that have already gone overseas back. But we're sitting here talking about a fuel tax increase. We just had a tax increase on January 1st with the fiscal cliff deal. We're going to have another tax increase on January 1st with the new health care rules. So tax increases make us less competitive. I don't think that the average American knows what the fuel tax is. I think that's not what they're concerned about. I think what they're concerned about is the price they see at the pump. And as late as 2009, the price they saw at the pump was less than $2 a gallon. And now it's $3.50 a gallon. So if there was a way that perhaps we could bring the fuel costs down, it might not be as much of a hardship to raise the gas tax a few pennies. Because you know, these people are suffering. The economy is still in the dumps, dragging along. Unemployment is far too high. And taxing them anymore in any aspect is not a good thing. You know, we've got all these proposals out here to bring cost of fuel down. We got this Keystone Pipeline proposal. We've got all these options for drilling on federal property, ways that we can use our domestic resources, keep from sending money overseas, and bring our fuel costs down. And the administration doesn't want to have any part of that, but they want more money for the highways. You know, if we could employ some of these things and make a meaningful drop in the fuel cost, then you're saying you need a 9-cent fuel tax rise. If that happened, then I don't think 90% of the people would even know. But adding to it on top of everything we've already put on them is just almost unconscionable at this point. So, you know, in terms of competitiveness, I think we need infrastructure investment. In terms of competitiveness, I think we need low fuel cost. I think taxes are generally anti-competitive. So, you know, the idea of adding another 10 cents a gallon on people who are already stretched to the limit right now. You know, the administration came out last week, said that they were going to increase their emission standards. War on coal, shut down coal plants. That's not going to do anything but drive everybody's utility cost up. It's going to make our businesses less competitive. Everybody's home heating bill is going to be higher. And now we're sitting here talking about raising fuel taxes at a time when people are just living paycheck to paycheck and barely making it. If we would use the tools we have and the resources God's given us, it wouldn't be so hard. Thank you. I give up the rest of my time.
Mr. Carlson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Cawley, Madam Trottenberg. I'm interested in working on issues related to intelligent transportation systems. I want us to build on the limited language included in MAP 21 and see a better utilization of smart technologies with our existing infrastructure and really begin to implement new technologies. I think that the utilization of intelligent transportation technology can improve safety, lower highway fatalities, reduce congestion, and help make our transportation system smarter and more sustainable. I'm curious if either one of you see a role for new technologies to help fix the funding deficit for the Highway Trust Fund. Are there ways to improve highway funding through new technologies at all? Are there any promising pilot programs, perhaps, in the states that should be considered at the federal level?
I would say a couple things on that, Congressman Carson. Thank you for your support of intelligent technologies. I think we think that is a tremendously important growing area in transportation in two ways. I mean, one, it does, offer the possibility of a lot of proven and low-cost ways to improve the efficiency of the existing system. As we're hearing, this is a very difficult question about how and if we're going to come up with more revenues, but we have a lot of intelligent transportation systems that can help use the system better that we have right now. Even the most basic things like signalization, ramp metering, there are a bunch of very low-cost technologies that I think states and transit agencies can make use of that will get much more utilization out of existing capacity, and that obviously will make our whole system more cost-effective. There is also, and I think Congresswoman Hahn mentioned, I mean, increasingly there are a lot of technologies out there, Easy Pass, all kinds of things, that to the extent that, at the state and local level, you're looking at different tolling mechanisms, et cetera, there are technologies that can make it a lot less intrusive and potentially, also a lot more cost-effective. So that's an area of tremendous potential, and one I can tell you at DOT that we're doing a lot of research on and we're very enthusiastic about.
It's not a subject I know very much about, but it sounds interesting, but I'm sure it will be also expensive as well.
All right. Thank you both. Thank you for your honesty. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Mullen.
Thank you for being here today. Thank you for the opportunity to, we'll just ask some questions. Seems like there's a lot more unknown there is known in this room. A lot of suggestions, but, really we run into a situation that I don't know if we're looking far enough ahead. Does either one of you have a projection of 20 years down the road where we're going to be? Because what I keep hearing from Mr. Cawley, I think I'm saying that, Cawley, and Mrs. Trottenberger, is that we're just looking to put a Band-Aid on something. Does either one have an idea of where we're going to be in 20 years, the shortfalls we're going to have or the infrastructure needs that we're going to be facing?
I don't have a projection going out 20 years, but I think in our testimony, we mentioned the size of the shortfall in 10 years is enormous.
Well, as slow as we move in the government, if we go just 10 years out, we're just going to be starting on today's problems. I mean, I don't mean it as a joke, but I'm being serious. Before we can get a project, we have a plan today. Before we can get a project, it's 3 to 5 years before we can get to see the dirt start moving.
It's a difficult problem.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very fair question, and I think as my colleague mentioned, I've seen 10-year projections, and essentially, as we've mentioned, the revenues to the Highway Trust Fund will sort of flatten out in the around $36 billion, going up a tiny bit, and there have been a bunch of different analyses out there over what the needs are. I mean, the trend lines diverge, and they continue to diverge in the long run. So I think the picture is even a little more dire 20 years out if we don't, do some interventions.
Sir, you had mentioned a 10-cent tax on gasoline and diesel. Have we thought about our natural gas vehicles, which is just on a rise? They're going to continue to rise. And our electric vehicles, how we're going to plan on making sure that they pay to drive the highways too?
CBO can't make any proposals about additional taxes that you all might want to impose on different kinds of alternative fuel vehicles. But when I look at the...
Well, it's not so much as wanting to propose. It's just if everybody's going to, what we continue to hear from this administration is pay their fair share. If we're going to continue to go down that road, then those that are using the infrastructure, which is every American, every individual, every person that comes and visits this country, gets to enjoy the benefits of our infrastructure that we have. So how are we going to pass it on to everybody other than just the individuals that are driving gas and diesel vehicles?
Presumably through a fuels-type tax for those alternative kinds of fuels, or some sort of vehicle miles traveled charge for the use of the roads. I don't know of any proposals out there to do those kinds of things at the moment. But when I look at the projections that the Department of Energy has about the vehicle miles traveled or anticipated to be traveled by these alternative fuel vehicles, they're not huge.
Well, the trend that we're seeing with natural gas and with electric vehicles, they're fueling at home, not at the pump. And so if we don't figure out a way to actually capture that, then we're literally just doing what government continues to do, and we just put a Band-Aid on it when we really need stitches. Ma'am, you had talked about this administration, the Obama administration, wanting to use the revenues or lack of revenues from our drawdown and our 2 wars that we've been fighting. But this administration, and I believe you will even admit, that that's dead on arrival. There's no way that's actually going to go anywhere. I mean, we're going to take more money out of DOD when they're already struggling with the cuts that we've already proposed to them, and we're going to propose more cuts. So does this administration actually have a true plan, or are they just going to continue to throw out suggestions, what we continue to see?
You know, again, I think, and I would note that that set of savings is one that's been talked about a lot on Capitol Hill, actually on both sides of the aisle, and I think people have different opinions about, what's really going to happen with it. But again, I would repeat what I said earlier, which is I think clearly the difficulty of this problem is going to be one. It is going to require Congress and the administration, House and Senate, Republicans and Democrats to work together. I don't think there's going to be a magic solution that's going to, just
And I do agree with what you're saying, but the thing is being a leader and I've been in the private industry or the private sector my whole life. When you're at the head, which this president is, you've got to make tough decisions, not just suggestions. You've got to come up with real solutions to propose something, not just throw something out and see if it sticks on the wall. And we continue to see that lack of interest and that lack of suggestion and that lack of leadership from this administration. And I think what Congress is saying is, look, we're wanting to work. You can tell both sides. It isn't just a Republican issue or a Democrat issue, but both sides are willing to work together. But at the same time, that's what this country has continued to do over and over again, is look to our president for some type of leadership, and we have yet to actually see that. I yield back.
Mr. Nolan.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, a couple of things. One, Mr. Cawley, I have seen numerous studies over the years on the significance and the importance of transportation to the overall general economic development of a particular region or constituency, as well as examples of individual costs to people for the lack of good transportation. I strongly suggest maybe have one of your summer interns do a little research, get you up to date on that, because that kind of information can be very helpful to our committee. In response to Ms. Frankel, I can tell you, the old bridge road in Mission Township, up where the Little Pine and the Big Pine come together in northern Minnesota, before we paved that road, I went through 2 front ends on my Ford F-150. But we got that road paved, and I haven't had a problem since. So that's going to save me several $1,000s in the future going forward, and is a good specific example of how good roads can make a dramatic difference. I applaud the other members of the committee here who have talked about the need to find other sources of revenue other than just user fees. The shortfalls you've talked about are obvious. The consequences are not good, and our roads are getting congested, and our mass transit is nowhere near adequate for what we need. And there have been several mentions of what is the administration proposing. Well, they have been supportive of the transfers from the General Revenue Fund under the argument that those are peace dividends. We need to remind ourselves around here that as we work on transportation and infrastructure, that is just one part of our overall budget requirements. And we've spent trillions, literally trillions, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in other places. And as the President has extricated us from Iraq and moving toward getting us out of Afghanistan, there's some peace dividends there. And other members have made a good case for drawing down from our general revenue funds to help support our transportation system. I would remind the members of the committee that recently there was an Inspector General's report on the money that was spent in Iraq, and they identified $60 billion that ended up not going anywhere. Projects that were blowing up before they were completed, projects where the money disappeared before they got a chance to go to work on them. You know, and that was just, you know, just a little tiny share of the trillions that have been spent there. So I want to remind the other members of this committee and the administration that we appreciate, number one, that the President is drawing down on those, that so-called nation building abroad. And hopefully that will continue to produce peace dividends that we can use for rebuilding America's infrastructure, our roads, our bridges. We don't need to remind ourselves. Our bridges are falling down. So I, for one, applaud the administration, and I applaud the other members of this committee who say let's take a look at some other sources of revenue, including general revenues. So I thank you for your testimony, and remind the other members of this committee that we need to be as bold as some of these other committees are in asking for money and for revenues. When we see what China and other countries around the world are doing, it's somewhat embarrassing to see the fact that we're pulling back and drawing back. Our infrastructure, our transportation system has been the foundation of our economic greatness in this country. And we need to step up and demand that we find a way to continue to finance it and advance it and take care of the transportation needs we have in this country. So be bold. Thank you. I yield the balance of my time.
Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's always great to be a part of such a committee like the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, because we always see the differences in the geography that we each represent. And I was taken by my colleague from California's testimony earlier about her electric vehicle and the high occupancy vehicle lanes. And I looked to my district, which, you know, our lanes are right and left. I mean, much of my district is a two-lane highway. We don't have the same issues that one in an urban area does. And it's up to us as policymakers to begin the discussions and the debate on how to craft a bill that's going to work in every single part of America. Like my colleague from Minnesota, I drive a Ford F-150. Thankfully, I have not had the same problems he has had hitting trees in Minnesota. But we do pay, in rural districts, a lot toward the gas tax. And unlike my colleague from California, I feel like I've been at a gas station. I haven't visited a gas station in 2 minutes, let alone 2 years. But those are the issues we deal with, and those are the issues that my constituents deal with. And I agree with you, Ms. Trottenberg, that, you know, I'm a realist too, that in this economic climate, the VMT might not be the only answer. Raising revenue through an increase in the gas tax may not be the only answer. You know, we need to look at a diversified portfolio. And with that, I have some specific questions about the VMT in particular, because in my district, my single mother who goes to work to make a living, to feed her family, drives 30 miles to get there. Similarly, under a VMT in an urban area, that single mother may drive 3 miles, may take her 30 minutes to get there, but under a VMT, my rural area, some of the more poor areas in Illinois where I serve, seems like it would be they would be subsidizing projects in more urban areas. So with the VMT, does anybody have any idea who was going to administer a VMT? Would it be up to the states, federal government? What?
I'll take a crack at that. And Congressman, just to be clear, I'm not proposing a VMT.
I know that. I know
Far
that.
from it. I mean, again, I think the one state that it's worth everyone taking a look at is Oregon, because they are going to be going ahead with an experiment. And just so you know, one of the ways I think they are seeking to address the very issue you raise, which is fairness for people in rural areas who drive long distances, is potentially to give people a choice, which is you would pay by the mile or you could pay a flat fee. So it potentially attempts to, at least for people in rural areas or people who drive long distances, cap what they pay. But I think there's no, that's a pretty difficult issue. I think Oregon's the only place that's really taking a look at it. So how it would be administered in other parts of the country or what might happen, there's no information on that yet. I think we have one state that's going to be looking at it in earnest, and potentially everyone can get a chance to look at their experience and take whatever lessons they want from it.
My question on that is, if Oregon is the test case, I mean, how do we do a national VMT then? I mean, we're going to have 50 different collections. That's what concerns me about the discussion of a VMT. How are we going to do this in a national plan? So I have concerns about that. I also have concerns, is the VMT the only option to bring revenue in from those who drive electric and CNG vehicles, or are there any other options that are out there?
Yeah, just for the record, I don't see there's any movement for national VMT, so I think Oregon seems about the only place that's really giving it a serious look.
Well, we hear about the national VMT a lot from different organizations that talk to us.
I think here in Washington there doesn't appear to be any appetite for it whatsoever. I know that a couple of the states, I think Virginia is one that have looked potentially for electric vehicles that don't use gasoline to potentially come up with some other fee structure. I think there are other ideas like that on the table that the states are looking at. Again, as Mr. Cawley says, I don't think there's anything at the national level that's seriously been proposed or looked at yet.
Okay, and Ms. Trottenberg, I have one more issue. I agree, our roads and bridges are a priority. Very disappointed that the stimulus bill that was passed before I came to Congress only had about 8% of funds going to infrastructure. But on the recovery website and the media reports, it seems that there's still $5 billion in unspent funds. Are those in infrastructure projects, or are those in other portions of the stimulus bill that didn't have to do with infrastructure, or what is being done with those funds? Are they obligated?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's one I'd like to get back to on. And thank you for saying you wish more of it had been spent on infrastructure. I think we feel the same way. We're pretty proud of what we did at the Department of Transportation. We got a lot of great projects built around the country. But I'd actually need to go back. I haven't looked at the Recovery Act website in a while, so let me go back and make sure I get you the right information.
No, I appreciate that, and I look forward to your response, and thank you for your testimony today. I yield back.
Representative Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, we've heard a lot this morning about how to deal with the revenue problems, whether it's the miles traveled or graduated gas tax or indexed gas tax or raising the gas tax or the general fund. I'd like to shift to the other side of the equation. We haven't talked very much about that. And sometimes an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. If we could do things that would make the need for additional investment less, I think that would be a good thing to focus on, and maybe Congress can be helpful with that. Las Vegas, of course, depends a lot on tourism, like Florida, like where Little Pine meets Big Pine. We need tourists. So we've adopted a complete streets program, kind of a holistic approach that reduces the need for a lot of costly paving in some instances, also the need for additional retrofits. That's bringing down the cost. I know that some other states have done similar kind of things. Washington State has a complete streets planning project. They've estimated that it's going to save about an average of $9 million, or 30% on each project. Maryland has got something similar going on. We're looking at commuter programs for the disabled, and have found savings of about $32,000 for the service for each individual. Could we talk a little bit more about what Congress can do to encourage states to develop complete streets programs to help bring down the cost. And at the same time, another one that distresses me that I think also served kind of the same function were the Tiger grants. Tiger grants help to provide more efficient, safer, better transportation projects. I know in my district we did a 12-mile bus rapid transit down Sahara Boulevard. But now I see that in the FY14 budget, not only you're not just reducing funding, you're not just eliminating future funding, you're rescinding past funding, and Tiger grants are going to be gone. So aren't we being penny wise and pound foolish, to use another old adage? Could you talk about those kind of programs?
Sure. Thank you for those questions. And I certainly think you mentioned complete streets. It's a great example. There are a lot of ways that we could reduce costs in the way we build and maintain and operate our transportation system. And there's no question that the complete streets movement is one, particularly in a lot of urban areas where we've been building a lot of roads to interstate standards, and we've really been overbuilding the roads. And in fact, there are much less expensive alternatives. And certainly there are complete streets. A lot of states have adopted complete street policies, as have a lot of local communities. The one challenge has been, once the state or the local community adopts that policy, how do you see that it really gets infused into the transportation planning as it's done at the state and the MPO and the local level? Because it's a real culture change. But it certainly states that have, states and localities that have adopted complete street policies have often seen, you know, the dimensions and the cost of the type of projects they need to build go way, way down. There are a whole host of other things that we could be doing to lower the cost of our transportation system. We have a procurement model which, compared to what some of our economic competitors in Europe and Asia do, is a pretty expensive way to do things. We design a lot of requirements up front in the procurement model instead of sometimes letting the private sector come up with cheaper ways to do things. So I think increasingly we in DOT are trying to work with states and transit agencies to find those economies, and I think it would be terrific to have Congress continue to encourage us to do that. And I'm glad you mentioned Tiger grants. We're very proud of the fact that because the Tiger grant program was a competitive program, one of the competitive dimensions we looked at was how much the application was bringing non-federal dollars to the table and what kinds of efficiencies were they using. And the Tiger dollars actually leveraged, even when they were grants, in the case of grants, but TIFIA loans as well, leveraged a lot of non-federal and private dollars. So it's proved a very good model, and I think you all probably saw the Office of Management and Budget put out a statement last night about the House's bill, and obviously we protest not continuing the Tiger program. We think it's been tremendously important, and rescinding those existing balances will potentially take money away from grantees that are expecting to get those Tiger grants. So we're very concerned about that.
Well, will you provide me some information so you can help me to make the argument that we shouldn't lose that program?
We will be happy to do so.
Thank you.
Representative Williams.
Well, thank you both very much for being here. Appreciate your testimony. I'm going to give you an idea that will work. I'm a small business owner, and I'm from Texas. And I also have been in the automobile business for 42 years. Now, Secretary Trottenberg, in your statement, you say this, referring to CAFE standards. Improvements in fuel efficiency contribute to a reduction in the trust fund resources and our ability to continue improvement of the nation's transportation system. Now, my question to you is, if we were to eliminate the EPA's CAFE and DOT requirements and let auto manufacturers build cars and trucks that the consumers really wanted, would we have more revenue for the Highway Trust Fund?
I think I'd have to unpack that question a little bit, because I think we have found, and I'm sure we're probably not going to agree with this, that actually CAFE standards have proved very, very popular, and they have saved consumers money at the pump. So I think in that regard, again, I think this administration is proud of what we've done on CAFE standards. There's no question, though, that, I mean, for better or for worse, one of the things that's resulted in that is less money going into the trust fund. It is a tough balance, but I think from the Obama administration's point of view, we'd rather have a more fuel-efficient auto fleet, and that's been a priority for us.
Well, that's from the Obama administration's viewpoint. I can tell you that's not from the consumer's viewpoint. Let me tell you about CAFE standards and what they do, okay? they're going to, if we go to the where this administration wants us to go, we're going to raise the average price for a new car by $3,000, today's dollars. New cars priced under $15,000, which right now are basically an entry-level type vehicle, they will no longer exist, and force an estimated 7 million consumers, 7 million people will be out of the new car market. They won't be able to buy a car. And no telling how many jobs that will cost in America. We get back to job creation again. Now, it also forces auto manufacturers to downsize vehicles, makes them lighter and less safe, directly affecting auto fatalities. Insurance companies will tell you that. So despite CAFE standards and the DOT standards, the U.S. continues to import an ever-increasing amount of foreign oil. So for both of your information, I've introduced a bill, and I think you should read it. It's H.R. 2445. It's a bill that would repeal the CAFE and DOT standards and would let the auto manufacturers supply vehicles that the consumers want and the consumers demand. And like you noted, you and I agree with this, like you noted in your testimony, it will increase revenue for our Highway Trust Fund and allow us to better improve our nation's transportation system. We'll put more money in. We'll create more people and let the open markets, let the consumer get what they want, and the auto manufacturers make what people want. So I'd like for you to read that bill. Thank you for being here, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Representative Napolitano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for staying and listening to all of our questions and everything else in the comments. I think most of the questions that I had been addressed earlier, and I did get here a little late, apologize. But, you know, there's the issue of the states getting a fair share of their taxes, the funds that go into your user tax. Your department oversees the maritime transportation, and I would like to know how you feel, whether it's fair or unfair, that maritime users at the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach pay $220 million a year to the harbor maintenance user fee, which is generally a tax, and receive $260,000 back in maintenance. And would you support a gas tax that returned 0.1% of the state that it collected it in? And is it fair that the industry has disparity?
Thanks, Congressman, for the question. And I know from you and your other colleagues who represent the West Coast ports, and look, it's a frustration we hear from ports all over the country about the harbor maintenance tax and what ports are getting back in terms of you know, what they pay in. Look, I think rather like we're discussing today with the gas tax, it's another area where there are a lot of difficult questions on the table, and I'm afraid I don't think we're probably going to solve them here today. But you know, this administration, you know, again, I think we understand the frustration the ports have on this, and I think we would love to work with you all to see if we can have some solutions. We've been, you know, big supporters of the ports, and at least through the Tiger Grant program, we've particularly tried to do what we can to provide support to all the California ports.
And I understand that, but the disparity there, we need to be able to ensure that whatever taxes are collected are used fairly. So if you're talking about disbursing the gasoline tax equitably, then we should look at other fees also. That's my point. The second question I have, Secretary Trottenberg, is you mentioned the negative impacts of Highway Trust Fund solvency problems on transit providers in small and rural communities. I'd like to hear specifically about the impacts on transit systems that rely on federal funds for operations. While slowing down payments to grantees is very potentially detrimental, not only inconvenient, to a system who is planning to buy a new bus, a system that relies on federal funds for operations will be forced to cut routes or lay off workers due to slowed payments. I'd like to know what you think DOT or Congress can do. How much notice will FTA provide to small and rural grantees prior to slowing the payments, one? What flexibilities does FTA have to select how and in what order those funds will be rationed? And thirdly, does FTA have the ability or authority to avoid slow payments to systems that use funds for operations?
Yeah, that's a good question, and you know, I had mentioned at the beginning of the hearing that, as you point out, if we find ourselves in a situation where we're starting our cash balances are starting to go down in the transit account, you know, we are going to try and give transit systems as much notice as we can so they can start to think about how they would plan for potential shortfalls. And there is no question, I think, that smaller transit systems will feel the pinch sooner and harder than larger transit systems, although, ultimately all transit systems rely to some degree on federal dollars. But I think in my testimony I mentioned there's some small transit systems around the country where, close to 60% of their revenues are federal. So it's not going to be long before they're going to need to start, as you mentioned, curtailing routes or slowing down on bus purchases. Well, I think we want to be careful because it's hard to know now what the circumstances might be, and I think we want to make sure we would keep our options open and be working with Congress. If we found ourselves drawing close to a time when we didn't have revenues to provide all the funds that we would customarily provide to transit systems.
But are you looking at a plan? Are you looking at a solution to help them?
Oh, no, absolutely.
Okay.
And I would say back in 2008, when the Highway Trust Fund was close to being insolvent, we basically formed a task force within the department, and we worked with Treasury to, I think, keep forecasting a lot of different scenarios and think hard about how we would minimize the impacts.
And are you getting input from these small urban areas?
Oh, yes. We're in, I think, pretty perpetual communication with our transit grantees and state DOTs. But, there is no question as the balances in the Highway Trust Fund start to go down, at some point there will be real impacts on the ground, and there'll only be so much we can do to potentially mitigate them.
Thank you. And the last comment I'd like to know is whether or not you're making any inroads on being able to cut fraud and abuse.
Well, I think, as you know, we have a particularly talented Inspector General at DOT, and that's one of the things that he spends a lot of time in. And I'm proud to say, he is a pretty rigorous analyst of a lot of our programs, as, by the way, GAO.
But is he funded properly to be able to do his job or their job?
I would say, actually, that the IG is very well funded. As you all may recall, in the Recovery Act, I think he was given $25 million and was able to really staff up. I would say also with Hurricane Sandy, he was just given, I think it was another $6 million. So, I'm sure he testifies in front of this committee from time to time, and you can ask him. I would also say that we at the department also spend a lot of time making sure that we are running our programs efficiently. We don't just wait for the IG. We try ourselves to constantly scrub our grant programs and our enforcement programs and make sure that we're operating as efficiently as we possibly can, and that there's no wrongdoing, and that we're getting good value for taxpayer dollars.
Well, appreciate your answers, and thank you for our help in our latest California saga. Thank you, both.
Representative Hahn requests a second round, and recognize her.
Thank you for hanging around for my last comment. Two comments. One, I do continue to think that we need to look outside of the gas tax box as we go forward to fund the Highway Trust Fund. I know my colleague from Texas thinks consumers want to buy the biggest and most gas-guzzling vehicles out there. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal today that talks about incentivizing consumers for electric vehicles by maybe offering them at no cost to get Americans to try out electric vehicles. So I think there is a move out there to incentivize. I know in Los Angeles we allowed electric vehicles to park for free. We've also, in California, we are allowed to be in the carpool lanes with an all-electric vehicle. So I think that is a trend that is picking up out there. I just wanted to back up what my Congress colleague from California talked about, the harbor maintenance tax. And that's an issue that I am really all about. I think we ought to fully fund it. I think there ought to be some equity and some minimum guarantee to go back to the ports that collect those taxes. But I'm also advocating for a possible use of the harbor maintenance tax to fund transportation projects in our port communities, sort of that last mile. I think as we're coming up with a national freight policy, I think we're really going to be looking at how do we move goods in this country. And I think one of those is one of the policies hopefully we look at is how do we fund projects that really enhance goods movement in this country. So I think if a port has been fully dredged, to its authorized level, which is the first use of the harbor maintenance tax. I think there ought to be some allowable usage for that last mile for transportation projects around our nation's ports. How important, Madam Secretary, do you think that tool could be for funding transportation projects in and around our port communities?
I mean, again, I think obviously, and I know you're a leader on the House Ports Caucus, and we've gotten to talk to you about this. And you know, you have some colleagues from California, Assemblywoman Bonnie Lowenthal, and others who are part of our National Freight Advisory Committee. And clearly, you know, these are not easy issues because you're balancing, you know, infrastructure needs that the country clearly has with the difficult budget challenges that, you know, we face in the administration and you face here in Congress. So, you know, I think the good news is clearly there is a lot of interest now in freight and in ports. And, you know, I think we're really going to have a chance to grapple with some of these issues and try and figure out what do we do? How can we make sure that we are making the critical investments we need to ensure, you know, that our country is economically competitive.
It's great that the President will be going to Port of Jacksonville on Thursday. It's his second speech at a port. I'm always happy to see him highlight the importance of our nation's seaports, as it certainly does, I think, really impact our economy and jobs and our competitiveness in this country. Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you. I'd ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing, and unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. And with that, I thank the witnesses for their testimony, and this hearing is adjourned.